The Suicide Squad is here. A motley crew of villains co-opted by a shadowy figure are sent to do the government's dirty work with a high probability of death. Sound familiar? You're probably thinking of Suicide Squad, a 2016 movie in which a motley crew of villains co-opted by a shadowy figure were sent to do the government's dirty work with a high probability of death. James Gunn's new movie is basically a do-over of the 2016 movie because, how can we put this politely? The first one had some, problems. What were they? We're glad you asked. One of the movie's biggest issues was its story. Simply put, it was the wrong story for these characters, or at least the wrong story for their first movie. You gotta walk before you can run, as they say. Part of the point of the squad is that they're not the cream of the villain crop. They're generally lower-tier bad guys, and their powers are small-scale, if they even have them at all. The 2016 lineup reflected this. A human sharpshooter, a deranged woman with a big hammer, a guy who throws things. Heck, their biggest hitter was El Diablo, who's pretty small potatoes in the pantheon of DC villains. Remember the scene where that government official posits, "What would we do if Superman tore off the roof of the Oval Office?" The answer was supposed to be the Suicide Squad, but what exactly is Harley Quinn supposed to do in that situation? Or Captain Boomerang, for that matter. These non-powered misfits needed a smaller scale, down and dirty story that matched their personalities and skill sets, and a big, epic, world-saving event was not that story. James Gunn seems to be focusing on that Dirty Dozen-style men on a mission vibe, which will hopefully be a better showcase for these kinds of characters. And while we're talking character problems, the main selling point of Suicide Squad was getting a bunch of bad guys together, throwing them into a sticky situation, and seeing them bounce off each other. No do-gooding superheroes in sight, just villains. We bet that most people went to the theater because they wanted to watch these messed up individuals bickering, bantering, and hanging out. I mean, that's why most people bought tickets. I wouldn't know, I only ever watch this crap on TNT whenever I'm waiting for AEW Dynamite every Wednesday. Hashtag not sponsored, hashtag please sponsor us. But sadly, we didn't get much of that. There was that scene in the bar, of course, which was kind of fun, but it didn't really fit with the story around it, and the dynamic between the squad didn't really evolve in interesting directions throughout the rest of the movie. In fact, the dynamic didn't really evolve at all. It's a shame because the ensemble was full of talented actors, and it could have been a lot of fun seeing them butt heads, as they seem to be doing in the 2021 movie. But hey, it's no wonder we showed up to a different movie than the one we got, as our next entry will explain. The marketing campaign for Suicide Squad gave us some pretty mixed messages, shall we say. Remember that first trailer that came out of Comic-Con in 2015? The vibe was dark and moody with that somber Bee Gees cover on the soundtrack and the sinister dialogue. Whatever you thought of it, that trailer gave us a pretty definite idea of what we could expect from the movie. Flash forward to 2016 and we got the first official trailer, and the vibe was, different. This one had Queen on the soundtrack, action, lots of quips. Again, it gave us a pretty definite idea of what to expect, but it was nothing like the impression the first trailer had given us. This was largely because of the confused behind-the-scenes process where Warner Bros kept changing their mind about exactly what kind of movie they wanted, something that unfortunately ended up bleeding into every aspect of the finished product. Hopefully, seeing as Warner gave James Gunn the pick of their available franchises, what we've seen so far of the Suicide Squad is what we're gonna get when we watch it, because sadly, the 2016 squad didn't really deliver on its promises. Tone is one of the most important aspects of a movie to get right. It's also one of the hardest, especially if you're juggling lightness and darkness. If you lurch too far in the wrong direction, the whole ship goes under. And Suicide Squad's tone was pretty much a mess. Honestly, we feel kinda bad for director David Ayer. Based on his previous movies like End of Watch and Fury, it seemed that Warner Bros hired him to make something dark and edgy, and you can see traces of that in the final product. But unfortunately, by the time of release, there was so much studio interference, so many conflicting edits, and so much general confusion that the movie swerved from one mood to another with no rhyme or reason. This made for a jarring viewing experience, and audiences were not on board. The point is, if you hire David Ayer, let the man make his movie. Hopefully they learned that lesson and let James Gunn do his James Gunn thing. Another issue with Suicide Squad's characters was that there were simply too many of them, and even though it seemed like half the movie was taken up with flashy character introductions with colorful on-screen text, we didn't really end up learning that much about any of them. As discussed, this was partly a problem of the story around them being too big and too busy with subplots, many of them unfinished. It also could have been that for a first movie, the squad needed to be slightly smaller so that each character could have more focus. Spend some time developing the ensemble, then throw them in at the deep end in the sequel. And it's not like big ensembles are automatically a problem in a movie. A lot of it depends on whether or not your director can handle them. James Gunn's new Suicide Squad seems to have even more characters than the 2016 movie, and while that may ring alarm bells with some, we know from his previous movies that he knows how to handle a big cast. So we're not worried, we think. Okay, bit of a nitpick in the grand scheme of things, but it's a symptom of a wider problem in the movie. So you remember Killer Croc? You could see from his top secret government dossier that he was supposed to be a 7-foot-tall giant. Except when you saw him, he was basically the size of a normal dude. Great makeup, but by no means a giant. This continuity error, while minor in many ways, illustrates a lack of attention to detail that unfortunately blighted the whole movie, with details often changing from scene to scene or contradicting themselves. And come on, a 7-foot-tall Killer Croc would have been awesome! I feel cheated. Oh well, at least we're getting King Shark in the new one. Okay, everyone loves a good needle drop. At their best, a recognizable song can supercharge a scene with fresh energy. It can recontextualize the visuals, and the visuals might even shed new light on the song. Think of Mr. Blonde playing Stuck in the Middle with you during the torture scene in Reservoir Dogs. Needle drops can give us the kind of primal thrill you only get with a movie. The licensed music in Suicide Squad was decidedly not that. We can only assume that somebody saw Guardians of the Galaxy and decided that the squad needed their own awesome mix. Unfortunately, they forgot one key detail, that the awesome mix was rooted in Star-Lord's character, and featured interesting selections that illuminated the scenes that they were used in. Suicide Squad just kinda had songs that were recognized. They played, then they stopped, then another one played over and over again. They even used Sympathy for the Devil, which was famous for being overused in movies before this movie even came out. Quentin Tarantino would not approve. David Ayer has been pretty blunt about the production process for Suicide Squad, saying that his original edit was, quote, ripped to shreds. Oof. Sounds brutal. We still don't know exactly how many reshoots and re-edits there were and how many different editors were involved, but the results kinda speak for themselves. The movie's tone was all over the place, and it didn't feel like there was a point where somebody looked at the movie as a whole, so they could make sure that everything fit together in a unified way. This was particularly glaring when it came to certain subplots, some of which just kinda went nowhere. A famous example is that of prison guard Griggs, who was heavily featured in the early going of the movie. He's seen to have plotted with Joker, he has an antagonistic relationship with Deadshot, he looks like he's going to be a major player, and then he just kinda disappears from the movie. Continuity, folks. It's important. People notice when you make mistakes like this. Now, let's continue rolling on with this retrospective of Batman Forever. Wait a second, that doesn't sound right, guys. Another pretty glaring discrepancy in the movie, Harley Quinn and Rick Flagg's hair. Yep, we're going there. From one scene to another, their hairstyles frequently changed visibly, to the extent that it was sometimes unclear which time period we were supposed to be watching. I mean, come on, surely somebody would have been up for the job of Harley Quinn's bunches coordinator. Seriously, much like the aforementioned issues with Killer Croc and Griggs, this comes down to too many cooks. There were a bunch of reshoots done for the movie, and it's often brutally obvious which parts they were, because they're shoved together into the edit with little regard for continuity. As a result, the movie feels like it was cobbled together by multiple different editors who maybe didn't even speak to each other and had very different ideas about the kind of movie they were making. Why does it feel like that? Well, maybe because that's what actually happened. And as a result, the movie's tone, pacing, and even basic continuity swerve all over the place from one scene to another, sometimes even from one frame to another. Editing, folks, it's important. Shout out to my editor friend who is taking care of this particular video. Hi, friend! How are you doing? Feel free to use that cliche, overused confetti graphic that people use when celebrating with the children going, yay! You probably know the exact one I'm talking about. Anyway, you know what else is important? Getting your iconic bad guy right. Oh, there have been thousands of articles, video essays, tweets, and angry comments written about Jared Leto's take on the Joker. Suffice to say, from the very first still that was released, people were, to put it politely, not really on board. The thing is, it made sense to try an interpretation that was wildly different from Heath Ledger's iconic performance in The Dark Knight, and it made sense for it to fit with the garish, gangsta rap music video aesthetic of the movie. Unfortunately, basically everybody found the final product pretty obnoxious, to the extent that it probably damaged Suicide Squad before it was even released. And that was probably a very interesting and somewhat deliberate choice of words. Shout out to that awful forehead tattoo. It left a pretty sour taste once people actually did get to see the movie, and James Gunn has diplomatically stated that he won't be using Leto's Joker in the new one. Ultimately, we think that's probably for the best. Good night, sweet clown prince of crime. Pop quiz. How do you know you have a problem with your movie? Answer: when the little flashbacks, subplots, and backstory you hint at feel more interesting than the movie they're in. Unfortunately, that was the case with Suicide Squad. As part of the character introductions for Harley Quinn and Deadshot, just to name 2 examples, we got some pretty cool little flashbacks. We got a condensed version of Harley's relationship with Joker, as well as a few glimpses of their date night where they ripped around the city in a sports car, raising hell. Not only was it cool, but it was also a better use of Jared Leto than in the rest of the movie. More importantly, it was more fun than the rest of the movie. And the same goes for Deadshot's implied history with Batman. I mean, we got a glimpse of Batman, like the actual Batman. That is cool as hell. Everyone wants to see Batman take on Deadshot, but it was barely a minute out of this 137-minute movie. And unfortunately, the Enchantress and her glowy brother just didn't really cut it as a substitute. And speaking of, just as Suicide Squad's story was too overblown to serve its characters well, the climax of the movie had the same problem. For a movie that marketed itself as being different and edgy with a spark of weirdness, the ending was disappointingly generic. Anonymous bad guys, muddy CGI, beams of energy, weightless revelations. Yeah, we've seen this before. And ultimately, what did any of it really mean for the characters or for us? Now, of course, a big climax with lots of CGI isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. James Gunn's new movie has a kaiju-sized starfish, for God's sake. But we are encouraged by the fact that a lot of the big mayhem in the Suicide Squad looks like it's happening during the day, with bright colors and fun. These are good things, by the way. And the climax of the 2016 Suicide Squad points to another strange problem with the movie. What's with the action sequences? I mean, David Ayer is a good action director. Both Fury and End of Watch have some incredibly intense and exciting set pieces, and Ayer has shown a good grasp of choreography, geography, and tension. Even his less celebrated movies like Street Kings and Sabotage have above average action. But while the action in Suicide Squad wasn't bad exactly, it was disappointingly average for someone like Ayer. Fight scenes were fairly generic and often not lit very well, so it wasn't exactly clear what was going on. There were disappointingly few quirky character moments, which is a shame because one of the most fun things about superhero movies is showing character through inventive, over-the-top action. Maybe it just comes down to the editing, but if we have one hope for James Gunn's new movie, it's that he nails the action part, because we can forgive a lot if the action's good. Look, Joel Kinnaman is a fine actor, and he has shown in the likes of Altered Carbon and Hannah that he has what it takes to be a compelling, charismatic action star. And going by that Bohemian Rhapsody trailer for Suicide Squad, it looked like he was gonna give us a fun take on your classic sardonic, gun-toting anti-hero. And then the movie tried to make him a tortured romantic hero, and it just didn't really work. Part of the problem was the lack of chemistry between Kinnaman and Cara Delevingne, who didn't really come across as star-crossed lovers. The writing didn't help, putting too much weight on their relationship without really setting it up or paying it off. But mostly, we just don't think that Rick Flagg needs to be a tortured romantic hero. He needs to be punching people, shooting guns, making jokes, and rolling his eyes at the stupid supervillains he's being forced to work with. And from the look of the new trailers, it seems that James Gunn agrees with us and is using him properly in this new movie. At least we really hope so, because we really want these movies to be good. It's just so much more fun to shout from the rooftops that a movie is great, rather than endlessly picking on its flaws. After all, even though there are many reasons why Suicide Squad ultimately didn't work, it's important to remember that nobody sets out to make a bad movie. All we hope is that the new Suicide Squad learns from the mistakes of the old one. You know, it's kind of fitting that James Gunn is directing Suicide Squad 2021. After all, Warner Bros kind of decided during the production of Suicide Squad 2016 that they wished Gunn was directing instead. But if somehow Suicide Squad 2021 also flops, who's gonna direct Suicide Squad 2026? Our pick? Wes Anderson. Just imagine it.